figuring out who's a safe person for scapegoat survivors. Do you often get confused over who's safe and who's not? And if you do take offense to someone's behavior, does it get confusing as to whether you're overreacting or not? Conversely, do you worry that you let too much bad behavior pass? Well, if you've watched these videos before, you know I talk about the 3 pillars of recovery, or sort of the 3 overarching principles that help scapegoat survivors recover from a history of narcissistic abuse. And the second pillar in that is to gain distance from narcissistically abusive people today and closeness to safe people. But a common question that arises in many scapegoat survivors is, how do I know who's safe and who's not? Well, the first approach, and I think it does hold some value, is to try to identify personality traits that might identify someone as unsafe versus not. So things like having a high level of empathy or the lack thereof, being comfortable offering up space in relationships, as well as taking up a reasonable amount at times, and say the ability to think under stress rather than being purely reactive. Those markers are important because they can really serve as guideposts to orient you towards who might very well be safe and who may not be. But then in the sort of ongoing process between oneself and another person, there become moments in such relationships that need to be negotiated. And the legacy of living as a scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent in childhood can add a real degree of difficulty to those negotiations. See, psychoanalytic theorists and researchers assert that children are born with a wish to have an all-loving, ever-present parent caretaker. And no human baby gets that wish fully realized, but usually in good enough families, these parents measure up to the child's wish just enough so that when they come up short, it's not devastating to the child. This is not the case for the scapegoat child of a narcissistic parent. This child's wish gets traumatically unmet and rejected, but it doesn't mean the scapegoat child relinquishes the wish. To survive, they may just have to store it in their unconscious. And I say to survive because the preservation of this wish is critical to preventing a psychological collapse on the part of the child. The collapse would go something like this. The child sees their parent as the one and only person in the world who can grant this wish they have for perfect caregiving. That wish feels necessary to live a life worth living in terms of how that feels. And this same person, when it's a narcissistic parent, is utterly incapable and refusing to truly meet the child's need in this regard. To acknowledge this as a child would result in essence, a collapse, making it extremely difficult to go on. So it's imperative that the child find a way to preserve this wish while organizing their mind, and typically their conscious mind, in ways that excuse their parents' ongoing abusive treatment of them. The preservation of this wish for perfect caregiving for the adult scapegoat survivor that once allowed for survival can make it very difficult to accept and know what to do with other friends or partners' occasional letdowns in relationships. That's because these letdowns can signal to the scapegoat survivor something like, oh no, this wish that's been so essential to me all my life may go horrifically unfulfilled yet again with this person. And when that happens, and this is all internal and typically unconscious, the old pain of what that was like in childhood with a narcissistic parent can feel very much alive in the present, even to an overwhelming degree, making it very difficult to sort of right size what's going on between you and this friend or partner today. Well, in today's video, I'm going to discuss how the old attempts to preserve the essential wish that someone's going to take care of you in the way that we were all born expecting can make it very difficult to distinguish who's safe today versus who's not. Then I'll talk about a solution for how to gain clarity about who's safe versus who's not, and how that relates to the caring of and eventual relinquishment of this wish. One of the essential ways of doing this is to participate in an ongoing therapeutic relationship where you get to make sense of and come to terms with what it's like when you might feel let down by people in your life today, and including your therapist, to parse out what part of your reaction is based on the contemporary person's actions or inactions, and what part of your reactions might be driven by how bad it used to be when you were traumatically let down by a narcissistic parent. And it may be counterintuitive, but it's these inabilities for people in your life today to fulfill this wish, yet remain available to you, that you get to learn such letdowns are now survivable, and believe it or not, develop functions inside yourself that allow you to give good enough care from within. Well, my name is Reid, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in working with adults who grew up as the scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent. The legacy of such a childhood is often having to live in an upside-down world today, where what feels good or something that promotes growth feels dangerous and scary. And then meanwhile, what feels bad or diminishing can very much feel steadying. What's worse is that many scapegoat survivors can blame themselves for having to live in this upside down world because nobody else seems to be doing so. And so I created this YouTube channel to try to offer explanations as to why and how this upside down world had to come about in the lives of scapegoat survivors, and to offer realistic strategies for what can be done to recover from such an upbringing where it grows to feel safer and safer to live right side up, or that is, where feeling good about yourself is allowed and even pursued. And in my professional and personal experience as a scapegoat survivor myself, I found 3 overarching principles that help people go from the upside down world to sort of the right side up world. And I call these 3 principles the 3 pillars of recovery. The first pillar is to make sense of what happened so that you know it wasn't your fault. The second pillar is to gain distance from narcissistically abusive people today and closeness to safe people, basically what today's video is all about. And the third is to live in defiance of the narcissist's rules. And a great way to put that third pillar of living in defiance of the narcissist's rules is my free ebook called 4 Ways Adult Scapegoat Survivors Can Heal. You can find the link to that book in the description box below or by clicking here. So why the scapegoat child has to preserve the wish for perfect caregiving to survive, and how it later makes it difficult to know who's safe today. Well, let me just give a quick summary about who the scapegoat child is to a narcissistic parent. It starts with that parent's core sense of worthlessness, which the parent can't tolerate. And unconsciously, that parent then sees in their child, who becomes a scapegoat, the worthless features that the parent can't stand in themselves. But the job's still not done because the parent needs to act in ways that influence that child to adopt the parent's worthlessness as that child's own. So what the parent will often do is devalue, emotionally deprive, and domineer or control the child in ways that send the message to the child that the child is worthless. Once the child unconsciously identifies with or determines that their parents only treating them this way because the child is so worthless, then the narcissistic parent's job is done of relocating this intolerable state of worthlessness within themselves into their child. And the child who repeatedly serves this role is the scapegoat child. Well, in, again, good enough development, a child is able to surrender this wish for perfect caregiving, which yields to turning towards themselves or inward to get the care they need to go through life. But that can only happen when the frustrations of this wish for a child, say in this type of good enough family, go something like this. First of all, there's very little active acts of devaluation, deprivation, or domineering from the parent towards the child. So there's sort of more of a background of safety. And then, it's clear that the parent is motivated to care for and tune into that child. But of course, in life, interruptions are going to happen. Maybe the parent's phone rings and it's an important call that they have to interrupt their play with the child to take. Well, initially, the child may feel hurt or dropped by the parent disengaging so abruptly. But if the parent comes back as soon as they can and re-engages with the child, then the child gets to learn over time that when mom or dad has to leave or has to turn their attention away from them, it comes back. This creates a sort of virtuous cycle where the child's able to remember the more typical ongoing context where their parent is tuned into them and demonstrating that they care about the child. And when a disruption of that occurs, the child's fairly easily able to convince themselves that the parent's going to return. And that in essence, it's like the good times generally happen, but when they get interrupted, they're very likely to return. And this type of ongoing and repeated experience makes it so that affords a backdrop of safety, you could say, where like now during the interim where say the parents talking on the phone and let's say the child's playing with their blocks, they might turn towards the blocks and really get into them, not skipping a beat, because they know that something terrible or traumatic didn't just happen, their parent's going to be right back. And it's that turning towards the blocks and kind of getting involved in them that reflects the child's growing ability to offer care towards themselves when there are temporary disruptions in connectedness to people important to them. But now let's look at what it can be like for the scapegoat child. This child lives in a world where the rule is being let down by the parent and the exception is being paid attention to, at least in a positive manner. A narcissistic parent, I think, fundamentally has not relinquished their wish for perfect caregiving themselves. So they expect that from the people closest to them, including the child. And the scapegoat child is required to try to meet their parents' demands for perfect caregiving or else. So since there's so much undue focus on the parent in this sort of reverse way, rather than the child, there's really no way for the scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent to accrue that kind of like good enough, ongoing experience with this parent, because that would require the parent to prioritize and keep their focus on the child rather than themselves. So to meet the parents' demands for caregiving and to stay in the only reality their parents willing to share with them, the child has to prioritize the parent and stow away their own wish for perfect caregiving for the remainder of childhood. And I don't mean to at all pathologize this wish for perfect caregiving, because I think it's what allows the scapegoat child and survivor to, in essence, keep hope alive that there's something good to get in relationships. And that wish can be what leads a scapegoat survivor to find friendships, relationships, or seek therapy in the hope that the wish will get met, but perhaps finding healing experience that it may not get met, but something else quite good can still happen. But with that being said, let's look at how this stored wish for perfect caregiving can get in the way of finding safe people today. Well, unconsciously, a scapegoat survivor who's had to store this wish for perfect caregiving may expect some deliverance of this from someone they hope is safe today. And I emphasize that it would be unconscious because by definition, a scapegoat survivor feels under-entitled. They don't operate in relationships where it's sort of like, I'm special and therefore I expect this special treatment. But rather, this would be happening very much unconscious and sort of out of scapegoat survivor's awareness. But when such a wish is operative, it can make being let down by such a person feel as devastating as what it used to be with the narcissistic parent in childhood. I think this is for two reasons that I would like to submit. One is that in the case of all trauma, the present can get confused with the past. And maybe that doesn't sound too earthbreaking, but in a subjective sense, I think it can be somewhat subtle, where it becomes really hard to know that what's happening now is different from then, and that who you are now is different than who you were when the traumatic events or even the traumatic childhood happened. And in kind, it can be hard to know that the other person who seems to be causing these feelings is different than who your narcissistic parent was to you back then as well. Sort of like a case of emotional mistaken identity that's extremely hard to correct in the moment, and especially difficult to correct on one's own. The other reason that a letdown from an otherwise safe person today can feel so devastating is that it was the preservation of this wish that allowed the scapegoat survivor to muster up enough buoyancy and sort of hopefulness in life to survive the abuse they suffered for so long and so early. So seeming punctures to that wish can feel like someone's kicking out the only leg you have to stand on. So in these cases, a scapegoat survivor may reject someone as unsafe when perhaps they are in fact safe enough Yet it's the attempt to negotiate this process that's kind of stymieing the scapegoat survivor from perhaps realizing this. Another way the preservation of this wish can get in the way of finding safe people today is by moving towards people who evidence abusive behavior towards you, yet you still believe they can offer you that perfect caregiving you're seeking. The unconscious logic may be something like, this other person needs to treat me bad at first so that I can change their minds about me and unlock all the perfect caregiving that I know they have to offer me. So a scapegoat survivor may invite people who aren't safe into their lives under the mistaken impression, but wish-driven hope that the survivor can make them into safe people. Well, I'd like to ask the viewers what challenges you may have noticed in your attempts to find safe people in your life today. I think it can be very helpful to others to share your answers in the comments section below, because it helps to combat the idea that you're the only one who might experience these challenges. Well, for scapegoat survivors, I think there could be sort of good and bad news to what I've been explaining so far. The good news is that there is a way to understand and eventually free yourself from the ways this wish has impacted your ability to find and stay with people who are in fact safe enough today. And the sort of bad news, I don't know if it's exactly bad, but whatever, the other type of news is that it does require accepting that some of your own perceptions of others may have been skewed by the influence of this preserved wish for ideal caregiving. And I want to say that I guess I call it bad news because the scapegoat child had such a steady diet of being told they're wrong, they're bad, there's something wrong with them, that to sort of say, acknowledge that maybe there's something imperfect in how they've been assessing and even judging people in their lives can feel like it sort of throws you back into this kind of a cauldron of like, see, I'm no good, or I can't even trust my own judgment. I'm faulty at my core. And if you notice that happening, I would hope and encourage you to try to catch that and maybe just bracket it for the time being. Because I think there's so much to be gained from being able to accept that there may have been a skewing of your perception and being able to forgive yourself for perhaps, not having like the perfect perception all the time can be powerfully healing in and of itself. Another part of the good news, I guess, is that it's never too late to find a relationship that proves it's now safe enough to surrender this wish for perfect caregiving. I believe that therapy affords a great way to do this, because once in therapy, you get to have a steady diet of being listened to, respected, and non-possessively cared about. And doing so can allow you to explore and prioritize your own experience while in the company of another person. But if enough time is spent in therapy, and I would encourage folks with this type of upbringing to try to give it a good amount of time, then I think it's pretty inevitable a client's going to feel let down by their therapist. Maybe the therapist arrives late, or they don't seem as attentive in a session as they typically do, or maybe they have to cancel at the last minute due to unforeseen circumstances, and the list goes on. But as you grow to feel safer in the relationship, and then even safe enough to talk about what you don't like about these letdowns that have occurred between you and your therapist, then the therapist has a chance to make it right, in essence. Take accountability for how they failed you, empathize and validate the feelings you had in response, and remain able and willing to resume the caring and goodwill they typically show you. So this is sort of like the adult version of that example I said earlier in the video of when a good enough parent has to answer the phone call when they're holding their child or playing blocks with their child. Something happens between you, the adult client, and the adult therapist, of course, and it disrupts the typical goodness between you two. But the therapist responds in ways that show they care about how their behavior affected you, and they're able and willing to resume the care and interest in you that you've come to expect. And part of this process in therapy is that it allows the scapegoat survivor client to also talk about what part of their reaction to the therapist was informed by the therapist's behavior, and also what part was informed by all the traumatic letdowns they've experienced in the past at the hands of their narcissistic parent. And distinguishing which is which today is an enormously helpful process in the therapy. And it's these experiences of being let down, but then being responded to in ways that show it's not as devastating as it used to be, as you learn more and more in the therapy that yes, you do get let down, but it's not nearly as devastating as it was in the past, because now someone cares about what it's like for you when you feel let down. They typically don't let you down, and you've come to expect that things will return to sort of a good normal after a letdown. And when this happens, again, repeatedly over usually a good deal of time, those inevitable letdowns in the therapist's responsiveness and emotional availability feel much more survivable, because now you can sort of take care of yourself in the face of their absence. And I'll give one example of how that played out with a therapist and a scapegoat client survivor. This client had to shelve his wish to be afforded perfect caregiving from nearly the get-go in his life. And he went to therapy because life felt very unfulfilling for him on the inside. Over the first year or so, the treatment went fairly well. But over time, this client began to notice that his therapist would start the sessions 2, 3, sometimes even 4 minutes after the agreed upon start time. Initially, the client had not even allowed himself to notice this, because to take issue with someone being willing to show him positive attention felt like something he was wholly unentitled to do. But as time elapsed and he felt safer and more secure in the therapeutic relationship, he did begin to notice this and realize that he didn't like it. So initially, he would bring it up to the therapist to say, hey, I don't like it that you're late. And each time it would be so hard for the client to do this, because of the punishment that used to happen if he were to do anything but show admiration towards his parent in the past. And so he had to prevent himself from ever knowing or feeling his own anger at others letting him down. That began to change with his therapist about a year into the treatment, and he began to bring it up, and his therapist would respond in ways to show a real true validation of the client's upset over the therapist's lateness. He wouldn't turn it on the client or say, this is your inability to accept shortcomings. No, it was to just validate that, you're perceiving something that's actually happening and I'm coming up short and it's not okay. Now, it would keep happening and the therapist would try, but he had a sort of characteristic way that prevented him from being as punctual as the client would rightfully hope for. So discussions would happen whenever the therapist would be late along these lines. And over more and more time, the client would certainly register when the therapist was late to himself. But in those moments, he wasn't overwhelmed with a sense of not mattering enough and wondering if his therapist just wasn't the right person for him to be seeing, and might get on his phone and occupy himself with something he was interested in, still feeling frustrated that his therapist wasn't arriving on time, and often telling his therapist as they started the session, hey, you're late again, but not in a way that felt as catastrophic. And I think this is one illustration of how the wish for that perfect caregiving can get gradually resolved in the course of ongoing treatment, not by browbeating the client and saying, well, you shouldn't expect so much from me. No, nothing like that. But through the ongoing responsive and empathic attunement to what it's like, and against, again, that backdrop of things going generally pretty well, where the client felt cared for and attended to 95% of the time. Well, so for clients who can go through this type of a process in their therapy, it then makes it much easier to determine how to make sense of such letdowns in friendships and relationships outside of the therapy. Because now you get to know that, yes, letdowns can occur, but when they happen against the backdrop of generally good enough friendship or relationship, then perhaps they're more survivable, and this person may in fact be safe enough. But I do think that's something that's really hard to sort of just teach oneself and needs to become a sort of lived understanding through this type of relational process. And I think a very helpful complement to the kind of therapy I'm discussing today is my Breaking the Scapegoat Spell live online group class. See, because in any model of trauma recovery, which recovering from scapegoat abuse certainly is, the first step is always to find resources in your life today so that you have the requisite strength to go through the process of recovery from the traumas. And this is a hard thing to do for scapegoat survivors because of how forbidden it's always been to recognize what's good about and in you, due to how punitive were in childhood were you to have done so. So in this course, I introduce tools and concepts to understand and free yourself from the old rules that insisted you stay unresourced to be who your parent insisted you be. And you'll do this not just from learning what's taught, but by applying these lessons in the in-class exercises, then by sharing what you're discovering with the partner that you get assigned at the start and stay with for the entire 8 weeks of the class. And it's this partner work that makes what you learn come alive and feel real. You get the experience of being able to share what stands in the way of you getting to live from your strengths to someone who really gets it. And you get to name what your strengths are to someone who's supportive in your partner. And that experience counters that early conditioning that saying what's good about you is being arrogant or selfish. And if this interests you, then you can learn more by clicking on the link in the description box below or by clicking here. Well, if finding safe people has proven to be a challenge and sort of confusing, then I hope today's video may shed some light as to potentially why that may be and what you might be able to do to help resolve and gain more clarity as to who's safe and who's not. And if you want to learn more about the challenges of finding safe people for scapegoat survivors, then I encourage you to check out this other YouTube video on my channel. It offers another tactic of how to deal with disappointments in relationships today that might prove useful. Well, with that, I want to thank you for tuning in today and your continued support of this channel and the resources around it. As I say, the comment section and what people are sharing, I think is just so awesome to see each and every week because of sort of the element of community I think that it builds. And with that, I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.